Well, I am delighted to introduce our first speaker to kick off this conference, Dr. David Finkelhor. Dr. Finkelhor is director of the Crimes Against Children Research Center, co-director of the Family Research Laboratory, and professor of sociology at the University of New Hampshire. He's been studying the problems of child victimization, child maltreatment, and family violence since 1977. He's well known for his conceptual and empirical work on the problem of child sexual abuse, and has also written about child homicide, missing and abducted children, children exposed to domestic and peer violence, and other forms of family violence. He's editor and author of 11 books and over 150 journal articles and book chapters. He's received grants from the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect, and the U.S. Department of Justice, among others. He received the Distinguished Child Abuse Professional Award from the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children in 1994, and the Significant Achievement Award from the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers in 2004. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Finkelhor.
Thank you very much for that kind welcome. I realize that in spite of that introduction, that very nice introduction, I'm not going to have anybody's full attention until I answer the question that's on everybody's mind. How do I acquire one of these dashing fashion accessories? Well, you're out of luck, I'm afraid. A lot of you need to have back surgery. I had some back surgery, actually now 3 years ago, and I'm recovering from it. But this is nice to have a good-looking walker to help me out with. There is, unfortunately, a pernicious rumor going around that I'm suffering from a deterioration of the spine due to too many years of groveling for government grants. And there's absolutely no truth to this. I've learned very early from my good friend Ernie Allen, who has some of the best posture of anyone I know in this field, how to grovel in a very ergonomic fashion. So I'm on my way to recovery. You can feel, I'm very encouraged about it, and I really hope to get back to my former job as the tackle for the New England Patriots. So enough about me. I'm here for you, and I want to acknowledge before I begin that members of this community really have been through an ordeal in the last year and a half. Sexual abuse does a lot of collateral damage that is often unrecognized beyond the harm to the direct victims and their families. I think it's not uncommon in the wake of sexual abuse for whole communities to lose their sense of trust and comfort and sense of ordinariness about just so many things, relationships that they have, the way in which things get done. And they go through a period of questioning about how to deal with a lot of things that they didn't really think about beforehand. And there's often also a lot of rancor about how this could have happened or how things got handled. You're not alone in having encountered these things. So I'm glad to be here. I'm eager to talk to you about what you've been through. I'm also honored to be part of a process that you've chosen to try and heal with and learn from, given the ordeal that you've been through. This topic, I'm afraid, no matter how you think about it, is grim and disturbing. So I'm going to start and also end by trying to be upbeat. And one of the ways in which I do that is just simply by reminding people of all that's really changed in the last 40 years that we've been grappling with this problem. I put up a few sort of indicators of some of that. A problem that was once very little discussed, very poorly dealt with, very full of shame and riddled with misinformation. But we've had almost a generation now of news coverage, prosecutions, films and novels on this topic, trainings of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of professionals, thousands of research studies, programs developed in all corners of this country and the world, in fact, an enormous quantity of information available through various media. There are a raft of new memes that have been coined that encapsulate in people's minds ideas and images of this issue, from things like Megan's Law, priest abuse, pedophile, McMartin, children's advocacy centers, internet predators, good touch, bad touch, passing the trash, sexting. All these things conjure up in people's minds some aspect of this problem. And I honestly think that the consciousness about the sexual abuse of children that has been awakened in the 20th and 21st century will be viewed in retrospect as a tremendous milestone in the history of child betterment. The effort to understand and remove this age-old scourge from what for many has been a nightmare of childhood will be seen as a major addition to human enlightenment and will be seen as having many positive cascading effects on society and subsequent generations. Now, I don't think we can claim to be the first or the only people in the history of the world to try to protect children from this sex offending. A little reflection would tell us that the instinct to protect children in this way is fairly deep and universal and probably has biological roots, actually. And parts of cultural practices as diverse as single-gender schools or burqas or statutory rape laws even, I think can be seen as at least in part efforts to protect children. But the modern awareness about this problem, I think, is revolutionary in two important ways. First, perhaps most obviously, the effort has been based on a more detailed and enlightened understanding of the problem and its varieties. I mean, we always reference the abandonment of the classic stranger danger model, but there's a lot more than that. We've really started and succeeded, actually, to inventory the full variety of situations and relationships where these violations occur: youthful perpetrators, teachers, religious authority, date rates. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I think we've also detailed a great deal about the motives and various strategies that offenders use. We've detailed the various elements that can contribute to harm, the stigma, the guilt, the family reaction, and so forth. And I think this complex set of understandings has been crucial to a much more enlightened approach. But then there's also, I think, a second revolutionary component that's less highlighted. I think we've begun to disentangle this problem from the clinging web of other more primitive, oppressive and social practices to which it was linked historically and culturally. So if you reflect on this, historically and culturally, efforts to protect children have often been confounded with many retrograde notions. I think of some of them, for example, the idea that certain disfavored social groups were intrinsically sexually predatory towards our children. In our particular historical case, we've seen blacks that way, or homosexuals that way, or immigrants that way. In the past as well, prevention efforts were grounded or surrounded by adult and family efforts to regulate and suppress girls in their independence, to exert tight control over whom they could associate with, or what they could wear, or where they could go. I think there were inflated notions connected to this problem over a sense of ownership stake in the honor status that was kind of conferred to the sexuality of young females. And I think that these efforts were also tied up with misguided efforts to control or restrict the amount of sexual knowledge that young people obtain. So I think one of the big developments in this historical period was mobilizing to protect children's autonomous sexual development, but without all that other baggage, all those repressive notions. We aren't entirely there yet, as evidenced by the fact that there's still people who are opposed to sex abuse education programs, and some because they see it as the introduction of dangerous sexual knowledge. But I think the change is really enormous. So I think that is really some very good news, and I'll come back to some other good news at the end. But now for some of the bad news. Now, of course, one of the bad news pieces, already been referenced by President Erickson, is the widespread occurrence of this problem. But compounding that, exacerbating that, and maybe even more serious than that, is the fact that we do such a poor job of actually counting and tracking the problem that exists. I put this up. This is from second or third grade curriculum, where we learn about things that are countable and things that are uncountable. We have carrots that are countable, and we have salt that isn't countable. And in public policy, we have that distinction too. We have things that are countable and things that are at least not counted. And unfortunately, that's often because we don't think that they count very much. But I just like you to notice some of the things that we consider to be very countable in this policy environment. So we maintain very close tabs on the number of people who contract cholera, who contract Powassan virus disease, St. Louis encephalitis virus disease, Q fever, and then 60 other infectious diseases you probably have never heard of. We know how many people contract those every year and exactly where they are in this country. We track the number of people who get bit by brown recluse spiders, the number of children who get injured from farm machinery, occupational injuries due to falls. And I talk about this stuff because some of the things that are most important about this problem we do not count, or do not count very well. Among them, we don't really know the total number of victims of child sexual abuse that are known to the authorities every year in this country. Incredible as that might seem. We don't know the number of teachers every year who are identified as having sexually abused a child. We don't know the number of coaches. We don't know the number of staff or volunteers in youth-serving organizations. We don't know the total number of convicted child sexual offenders who are identified every year in the population, or even what that number is of who are residing in prison. We don't know the number of juveniles who are engaged in prostitution. We don't know the number of child victims who are obliged to testify in court about their victimization. These are all things that are very important for doing good public policy on this issue, and I'm really appalled to say that we are not counting them well. Why not? Well, I don't have the full answer to that question. A big part of it is that this problem is spread across a number of different institutional domains that don't work all that well together and haven't gotten coordinated about tracking this problem. One of those big institutions is the child protection system, which actually probably has the best numbers that are available. And they are the ones who use the term child sexual abuse. But in the child protection system, the numbers that they count, and I'll show you some of them soon, only pertain to abuse by caregivers and primarily in the home environment. So they do not include all the cases of sexual abuse that occur outside the family, in the community, at the hands of strangers, and particularly at the hands of other youth. Then we have the criminal justice system, which also has a large role in this problem. They don't use the terms child sexual abuse. Their major data collection systems, the FBI, the Uniform Crime Reporting System, the National Crime Victimization Survey, they don't count child sexual abuse or child molesting. They count things like forcible rape, sexual assault, They're not very good at counting the children who are involved. They use terms like indecent liberties, gross sexual misconduct, a whole bunch of criminal justice gibberish that is kind of hard to match up with things like sexual abuse and know exactly what's going on. They're not very good at tracking stuff that doesn't rise to the level of an arrest, particularly child-on-child sexual offenses. So there's that problem. There's the vocabulary problem. And there's the fact that a lot of the data systems, unfortunately, were set up prior to the current era of concern about sexual abuse, so didn't really incorporate measures of child sexual abuse into their data system. So what can we say? Well, the best data, as I said, comes from the child protection system, which at least every year compiles a national estimate of all the child sexual abuse cases that are substantiated by state child protection authorities around the country. And that number for the year that's most recently available, 2010, was about 68,000 cases substantiated by CPS. But as I said, that excludes an awful lot that we know is being seen by authorities, including non-family abuse, stranger abuse, juvenile offenders, and so forth. We can make an estimate of about the number of cases that are seen by a local law enforcement authority. It's about 45,000, but this is a kind of crude estimate. It excludes some of the stuff that gets seen by CPS. And we know that both of these are undercounts of what is seen by authorities because at least every 10 or 12 years, the federal government does a national incidence study of child abuse and neglect where they choose a representative sample of child serving professionals from around the country and do a prospective count of cases of abuse that come to their attention and then extrapolate to the country as a whole. And based on the most recent data that they have, which was from 2006, they estimated that about 180,000 cases were known to community professionals. But to be able to talk in this kind of approximate way with numbers that don't come out very, very often is really a tremendous disappointment. This problem really deserves much better numbers. There are other ways of thinking about and talking about it, but they also have some limitations. Efforts have been made to kind of look at the problem, all the cases that occur to victims that never get reported to authorities. This is done typically with victim surveys. And there are limitations to that. We have one that we've just completed, a survey of 4,500, or the experiences of 4,500 children in the United States, a nationally representative sample, where we interviewed the youth themselves between the ages of 10 and 17 and the caregivers of the children 0 to 9. And based on that study, we make an estimate that in 2011, there were about 1.6 million contact sexual offenses against juveniles. But there's a pretty big, what we call, confidence interval around this. We know we've missed some. This is not a tremendously precise estimate, but it does give you a sense of how much is still not coming to authorities. The numbers that are usually cited are these 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys. But unfortunately, a lot of those numbers come from surveys of adults that represent cohorts of children that are now quite grown up and may not represent the experience of today's children. So we don't have enough surveys. The survey that we just completed included about 800 or 900 older youth who were kind of roughly at the end of their childhood, and we could make an assessment of what the lifetime prevalence was for them. And it turned out in that sample, about 4% of the males and 17% of the females reported a kind of contact sexual abuse in the course of childhood. Broken down, you can see this included about 3.6% of the females who said they'd had a completed rape in the course of their childhood, about 6% who'd had child sexual abuse at the hands of a known adult, and 11.3% of the girls who said they'd had sexual abuse at the hands of a peer. This is satisfying in the sense that it does clearly establish that child sexual abuse is widespread. It does confirm that most of it is still not known to authorities. But for purposes of really understanding and tracking, as I said, we really could do a whole lot better. One of the real exciting developments is how much information about sexual abuse is now available all over the world. It's not just in the United States where the science about this issue really started out. There was a recent meta-analysis, large-scale review, which managed to turn up over 330 community prevalence studies of sexual abuse in the world at large. And it found worldwide that the rate of sexual abuse lifetime for kids was about 18% for the girls, 7.6% for the boys. Once again, though, this includes many studies that were done of substantially older populations and doesn't represent necessarily the current cohort of children. I think the most interesting thing from the international comparative studies, though, is that sexual abuse does seem to vary in different parts of the world. In particular, it seems to be higher in North America and Australia, lower in Asia, in Europe. And this, I think, provides us with some interesting fodder for trying to understand more about the kinds of cultural features and prevention policies that may help to reduce the amount of sexual abuse. I can talk more about this later on if you have some specific questions. I think the conclusions from the international studies are that sexual abuse is present in every place where it has been sought. There's no place that seems to escape it, but that rates do vary in patterns that do merit more interest. Now, while the studies aren't great in tracking exactly all the dimensions of the problem, they have been pretty good in alerting us to many of the risk factors, many of the things that put children at risk, or at least signal kids who seem to be at greater vulnerability. Some of these are well known. We know that girls suffer considerably more sexual abuse than boys. The ratio is about 3 or 4 to 1. We do know that older children have somewhat higher rates, although risk for sexual abuse exists at virtually all ages. Peer assault tends to peak in adolescence, but for example, the abuse of boys tends to occur more frequently at younger ages in the pre-adolescent period, and then tails off somewhat there. We do know also that conditions of family conflict and disruption, children who report that their family, that they were not living with some of their parents, who were living with other people, who had moved around a lot, whose families had suffered disruption as a result of imprisonment, divorce, mental health problems. These children are at substantially higher risk. Children who grow up under conditions of neglect. And I think two main features are responsible for the higher risk. First of all is the lack of good supervision, so that adults aren't kind of monitoring what children are doing and aren't there to protect them. And secondly, emotional neediness that makes kids vulnerable to the kinds of ploys that child molesters use to get access to them. Children who are needy because they're not getting the support and attention from adults that they require. Another risk factor that is well established is the presence of other kinds of victimization. Kids are more likely to be sexually abused if they're in families where there is domestic violence, where they've experienced physical abuse, if they're the victims of bullying, if they live in communities where there's a lot of other crime going on. So victimizations tend to aggregate, and kids who are experiencing one kind are considerably more likely to experience other kinds as well. The studies that we have also told us a considerable amount about perpetrators. I think our data is particularly rich on this, and I'm hoping that my colleague Keith Kaufman and some of the other presenters will talk about some of these things as well. I mean, one thing that's very well known, of course, is that men really are offenders to a far greater extent than women. Women constitute about 5% of the overall offenders. They do offend, though, and that's something that does need to be kept in mind. Something that is less easy to keep in mind, though, is that a lot of perpetrators are other youth. And I'll come back to this, but even 37%, so more than a third of the cases of sexual abuse that come to law enforcement attention involve other youth as perpetrators. And once you go to the self-report surveys, you see an even larger number, between a third and maybe 3/4 of all the sex offenses that young people report in these self-report surveys are at the hands of other youth. So this is a very big part of the problem that often gets neglected, but I'll come back to as well. And then, as President Erickson said, there's quite a diversity of offenders, but it is mostly people in the social network of the victims. About a quarter of them are family members, 60% acquaintances, and then 15% the child does not know. The family comprises the big majority of the CPS cases, because that's what they're focused on. And family abuse is a kind that's particularly less likely to get disclosed. Now, one of the things that I'm going to harp on here is the diversity of the contexts and people who do this to children or where this occurs. We have a tendency to get a particular image in mind of what child sexual abuse is about, and I think that often really keeps us from approaching the problem in the comprehensive and complex way that we need to. So I'm going to touch on some of the main kinds of abuse in different contexts where abuse occurs as a way of sketching out this territory so that you have some of this complexity in mind. And I think, this is sort of the main rule that I always urge people in thinking about policy and prevention and even intervention, is to keep in mind all the diverse kinds of situations where they're going to be trying to address when they address this problem. So, of course, let me start with intrafamilial sexual abuse. Fairly well publicized, includes fathers, stepfathers, older brothers, uncles, and grandfathers who take advantage of the kids who are in their care. We know that stepfathers and stepfamilies are at particularly high risk. We know that intrafamilial sexual abuse tends to have an earlier onset because obviously they have access to young people at a very early age, and tends to be at longer duration, in part because of the early onset and part because of the ability to keep that kind of abuse hidden. It can involve multiple victims, multiple children in the same family. As I said, tends to have a lower disclosure rate than abuse that occurs outside the family. It also has, interestingly, a lower reoffense rate. Intrafamilial abusers are less likely to reoffend than are extrafamilial offenders for a variety of reasons. Some of the risk factors of intrafamilial abuse that I've already touched on: the presence of family violence, poor supervision or compromised supervision by other members of the family, neglect of children. One interesting feature, although not well established but speculative feature that's been shown by some of the research, is that when particularly adult men are involved in the early caregiving of children, it tends to serve as a kind of protective feature and deter, or at least inhibit, sexual abuse later on. So that's by way of saying that we should be encouraging men to get more involved in the care of children, not keep them out of their care. Intrafamilial abuse gets a lot of attention, and sometimes, though, the fact that the next layer, the next social network layer of children is also a fairly risky one, particularly the adults and the older children that they encounter in the neighborhood, in the houses of their friends, among their parents, associates. There's a large amount of sexual abuse that occurs at the hands of these offenders as well. And then peers are, as I said, a very common source of sexual abuse. I think there are two main contexts that are worth distinguishing here. There is the peer sexual abuse that occurs in the context of bullying, harassment, sometimes at the hands of groups where the intention of the sexual abuse is to humiliate, to degrade, to intimidate. But there's also a great deal of sexual abuse that occurs at the hands of same-age peers in dating relationships, in friendship relationships where one peer tries to take advantage of closeness, intimacy, aloneness with a friend, and impose some kind of sexual attention on them that's unwanted. This is a very common. Okay, you've gotten an education in this, but there's a whole class of people that sort of stand in a kind of similar relationship to children. These include teachers, youth staff and volunteers for youth-serving organizations, staff and clergy and religious organizations. These, probably the most common category is school personnel, simply because those are the adult mentors and professionals that kids actually have the most contact with. But it's actually a group that we haven't done a good job, I think, at counting, paying attention to, and hopefully Cheryl Shakeshaft will be able to cast some light on this. These are people who have unique grooming resources because of the authority that the institution vests in them. And these are cases of sexual abuse that are very divisive because they involve a whole community of people and often involve individuals lining up on the side of the offenders and the victims. These are cases that involve institutions and oftentimes highlight the poor management or of institutions in handling of either the prevention or the disclosure. So these tend to be complicated and high publicity cases. Older youth victimizing younger children. There are a lot of kids who are victimized in babysitting contexts, victimized by older siblings and cousins or older neighbors. There's an interesting spike in this kind of abuse at the onset of puberty among the offenders. So 10, 11, 12, 13. You also see an unusual number of female offenders in this group who are taking care of kids. There's suggestion in the dynamics that some of these kids are trying to make sense of sex, get information about sex that they haven't been able to acquire in more healthy environments, maybe influenced by the media, things that they've seen. I'll come back and talk a little bit about this in the prevention section. This is a group that hasn't gotten very much attention, and I'll talk considerably about this. What I call statutory victims, other people call compliant victims. These are, for the most part, teens. They are teens who get into relationships with considerably older partners, most often in a voluntary way, because they see some potential in this relationship for excitement, adventure, think that they're in love, want to find out about sex and feel like this is an opportunity to do so. We see in this group, too, an unusual number of female offenders as teenage boys get involved with older women. Older partners can have a strong allure for teenagers because of the resources they have and the confidence that they exude and the flattery that the young people feel by the interest that the adults have. About a third of the arrests for crimes against children that are logged in police reports are for statutory sex crimes. So it is a large part of the problem, and something that I think we should be paying more attention to. I'll come back to this. It probably makes sense to distinguish between offenders who are just a little bit older than these teens, so in the 18 to 25-year-old group, and those offenders who are kind of way older, kind of more in their parents' generation. Commercial sexual exploitation, something that we're paying increasing attention to, and I think deservedly so. The kind that has gotten the most attention is pimp-facilitated juvenile prostitution. But unfortunately, I think that's gotten stuck in people's mind as the emblem of this kind of dynamic, but it isn't. There are a lot of young people who get into selling themselves on an independent basis. This is particularly true among the males who do so, but it's also true about a considerable number of the females. We really have to sort of pay attention to and understand those dynamics. There's been a movement, I don't know where it comes from, maybe Ernie will enlighten me, to kind of refer to all of this stuff as trafficking of children. I'm not a big fan of that. I think that although you hear people say, well, we don't want people to think this prostitution stuff is really, just a voluntary kind of choice that young girls and men ought to be allowed to have. But I think that the trafficking concept introduces a whole lot of other misconceptions. The vast majority of these kids who get involved in commercial sex are not taken from one place and dragged to another place. They are mostly engaged in these activities in the towns and cities where they grew up. And we know this from some of the studies that we've done. We do know, there's a lot we don't know. Maybe I should say there's a lot we don't know about this group. You'll hear some numbers about this, 300,000 kids engaged in prostitution, 100,000 kids. We really don't know. The numbers on this are very bad. I would really wish people would stop using those numbers because I think this is a very hard problem to count. I've heard the number, kids start prostituting themselves on average when they're age 13. Once again, I'm suspicious of that number. I don't think it's based on very good research. And if it's average 13, that means there must be a bunch who are starting when they're 9. That doesn't seem real plausible to me. But once again, I think this is stuff we need to pay attention to in its variety and in its impact. And then the question of whether the internet should be thought about as a separate dynamic of sexual abuse. And here again, I have a kind of controversial point of view on this. It's not clear to me that internet perpetrators are a distinct group from other perpetrators. Although we have a lot of terms to apply to them, internet pedophiles, and we talk a lot about this problem, I'm not sure that it deserves that distinct representation. One thing, we have been doing studies of internet sexual abuse both from police arrest records and also from surveys of young people for 10 years now. Most of the internet-facilitated child sexual abuse involves people that the young person knows from somewhere else in their life but gets into contact with over the internet because it can facilitate their interchange. So it's not primarily a venue for youth to meet people that they don't know. That sometimes happens. But all forms of social interaction are migrating to the internet. And so we would expect that most forms of sexual abuse would go there as well. The parallel that I like to make in sort of getting people to question this thinking about whether the internet is really a distinct form is, the automobile, when it was first developed, probably changed the dynamics of rape to some degree because an offender could take somebody off and sequester them. But, we didn't develop the notion of the automobile rapist, or we didn't develop the notion of a telephone child molester when the telephone came along and facilitated. And I think we will look back and see the internet is just as another form of communication. It's not a distinct dynamic as far as child molesting or sexual abuse has occurred. The one exception, though, that I think might be worth looking at in this regard is the non-molesting child porn possessor. There may be some new dynamics there, a new kind of offender who really had a very difficult time accessing this material before, and so we get different kinds of people who are doing that. But we still don't know, I think, enough about that group. Overall, though, I would discourage people from focusing too exclusively on the internet molester as a separate category. Now, in spite of all that we've learned, and I mean, I think it is truly breathtaking, there still are a substantial number of misconceptions that I think pervade public thinking, media thinking, and even policy thinking about this problem. And I'm going to highlight a few of what I see the most important and pernicious ones. And you may be surprised at some of this, and some of you may end up wanting to argue with me about it. So I think it'll be a useful discussion to have. But these are some points that I think really would bear some consideration about whether we've arrived at some misleading stereotypes about the problem. Okay, I'm going to go through each one of these. So, now, first of all, what is a pedophile? Keith may talk a little bit more about this. A pedophile is somebody who has a primary and enduring sexual interest in prepubescent children. And not all child molesters, in fact, a majority of child molesters do not fit that description, even though we have taken colloquially in the media calling all these people pedophiles. It's clear that about a half of all victims are developed teenagers, so the people who are attracted to them are not pedophiles. Even a third, from studies that have been done, a third of the offenders who molest kids under the age of 13 are not primarily sexually attracted to kids, but do so for a variety of reasons. Lack of availability of other sexual partners, a particular opportunity that makes itself available. And then, as I told you, about a third of the perpetrators that come to law enforcement attention even are other youth. The diagnosis of pedophilia is rarely present among youth. So for all these reasons, it does not make sense. It is a misnomer to label child molesters as a group as pedophiles. Even more controversial, I'd like to argue that there are a lot of child molesters who should not be described as predatory. Now you'll say, well, but they're committing a crime, they're exploiting children. Yes, that's predatory. Yes, that's true. But what I mean as predatory is somebody who comes into relationship with the child or comes into proximity to the child with the goal of committing a sexual act with that child. I think a dominant paradigm that we have is that all child molesters are out there kind of circling like birds of prey and trying to find niches where they can insinuate themselves into youth-serving organizations or families and get access to children. That certainly happens and is one of the most insidious dynamics. But there are a large number of offenders who I believe, and I wish we had better research on this, but I think that the dynamics are clear, who are in contact with kids for completely benign and positive reasons, because they like being mentors, they like coaching sports, they like teaching, they like hanging out with their nieces and nephews, they like babysitting. But then because of the relationship that develops, because of some special closeness that happens, because of some opportunities that arise, these adults suddenly feel some sexual interest. Maybe this child has a crush on them. Maybe this adult really realizes that this child has special qualities, and something kind of awakens. It could be a problem in the adult's life, and they then turn that relationship into a sexual relationship. And I prefer not to call that predatory, and I think it has very important implications for prevention, and I'll come back to. But I think we have to recognize that that dynamic occurs. The fact that not all offenders are pedophiles and have a recognizable and are aware of a sexual interest in children, the fact that they join organizations without having an intent to sexually abuse, I think this means that we cannot simply identify these individuals who are going to be at risk for children on the basis of their interests, on the basis of some sexual orientation, on the basis of some test of their sexual proclivities, using polygraphy to find out if they're lying about whether they're interested in children, on motives that they express about why they want to do whatever they want to do, or any kind of screening. It's a much more complicated problem, I think, than the predatory model would suggest. Another fly in our idea that we can protect children through a kinds of screening mechanism. It turns out that if you look at the offense histories among offenders who get caught for sexually abusing, only about 10% of them have a prior sexual abuse offense in their history. And that's very important because it means that even if we could perfect background screening so that we could eliminate every known child molester from the environment of children, or even if we could be totally successful with our sex offender management strategies so that we could make sure that nobody who had ever offended before would re-offend, we'd still be preventing maybe 10% of the problem, a small quantity of the abuse. So it means, obviously, that screening and background checks and offender management, while important, are just a small part of really what we need to be doing if we want to prevent sexual abuse. I think the implications of all of this is kind of clear. We can't profile offenders, and not only that, but it is very difficult to identify them. People have a general sense child molesters tend to come from higher educational backgrounds. They tend to have better social skills than the typical criminal population. And their sexual behavior in regard to children is very diverse, does not include necessarily or with certainty an interest in contact abuse. It can involve photographing children or viewing them. It can involve, doesn't necessarily involve penetration. It can involve various kind of fetishistic and kinds of preoccupations. I think the bottom line here is that instincts that people have about who we should be suspicious of, who is risky, who is benign, and who is dangerous are very often misleading. And we do, I think, much better served by training people to be on the lookout for behaviors that seem risky and problematic rather than personal characteristics that might alert us to the fact that somebody is dangerous. The dangerousness of sex offenders has been exaggerated. There are a group who are indeed very dangerous and who continue to offend throughout their lifetime. But the average recidivism rate among sex offenders is lower than that of the rest of the criminal population. I assume Keith will talk a little bit more about this. The kind of meta-analytic studies that I was able to find suggest about 14% reoffend within 5 years, maybe a quarter after 15 years. But that rate may actually be declining. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So I'm not sure that that actually is the most current, but I put that up there to show you that a large portion of molesters, even under the kinds of systems that we currently have, do not seem to reoffend. The rates are particularly low among juvenile offenders. And I think that one implication of this is that very severe punishment and expensive and long-term management of offenders is not needed for all offenders. We will do better for, I think, everyone involved. We've actually found that some of the draconian punishment actually has boomerang effects. So we need to do a much better job at risk assessment. We have some good instruments for doing that, trying to identify who are the most dangerous offenders, but then also titrating our approach so that we have less onerous management strategies for those who are not at risk. There was a time when, and this may still be prevalent in some places, where people thought, gee, a young person who starts to offend at age 13, 14, this must be a particularly severe form of sexual deviation. These kids must be headed for a lifetime of repetitive offending. It turns out not to be true. We now know a great deal more about adolescent sexual offenders. And it's very rarely the sign of incipient pedophilia or sexual deviation when kids commit these kinds of acts. And as I said, the recidivism rate is considerably lower for adolescent offenders than it is for adult offenders. And as we've come to understand the motives and the dynamics of adolescent offenders, we find that a fairly significant group appear to be offending for rather transient and minor kinds of impulses due to peer pressure or being under the influence of some media, and that oftentimes, education and certainly the shaming that occurs around the discovery are plenty to sort of put the kid back on a good track. We find that general delinquency and propensity to commit other kinds of offenses is much more kind of common problem and lies behind much more teenage sexual abuse than does a form of sexual deviation. The good news here is that it looks like there is quite a bit of success in preventing and treating sexual abuse when it occurs at an early age, and that long-term sanctions and supervision are often not necessary and once again can be very counterproductive. I think most of you will probably have gotten aware of this, but there's still some places where this is not, I think, well appreciated, that most child sexual abuse is not violent. It occurs and develops in relationships of trust, and because of the large incentives that the adults have in terms of defining right and wrong, like normalization, providing incentives to the kids, giving affection and attention, that the sexual abuse occurs without violence and coercion. And one of the reasons why this is important is that there's still places where we kind of gloss over that. We still tend to refer globally to all these offenses as sexual assaults, for example. But to the extent that victims, parents, and investigators think that real sexual abuse is violent and coercive, and that what happened to them does not fit that description, the victims are inclined to blame themselves, see themselves as somehow complicit or contributory in ways that they shouldn't have. And so I think it's very important that we educate people about what the true dynamics of this, and that violence is not present in most of these kinds of episodes. I'm going to go even further here and point out that for an important minority of kids who are sexually abused, they actually find the experience, at least initially, as maybe pleasant and maybe participate voluntarily, that it satisfies a need that they have to learn about sex, or that they like the attention and affection that they're getting from the offender, or that they think that they are maybe in love, or that this is somehow a relationship that could work. And that these victims frequently protect offenders. They don't want this to be disclosed. They don't want the police to investigate. They don't want this person to go to jail. And this is also a feature of the abuse dynamics that we have not really, I think, described accurately, partly because we were afraid that people wouldn't take it seriously. That's the part we need to address, is get people to take it seriously, and I'll come back to that. But this means for our prevention, for example, that we can't describe sexual abuse as feeling yucky and that as a way of letting kids know what they should be resisting. And we have to anticipate that kids are going to feel guilty and blame themselves and take steps to really counteract that. We have to recognize that kids are going to lie frequently about what happened because they either don't want it to be discovered. They don't want their part in it to be discovered. Or sometimes they lie about the dynamics and say, that violence was involved. And that turns out to be a problem when it comes time to prosecute, because the testimony that the kid gives doesn't jibe with the actual evidence that exists. So this can be a problem, and I think by acknowledging what the dynamics are and publicizing that, educating people about that, we'll help move awareness about this problem on. This is another, I'm afraid, not well discussed reality about sexual abuse. I wish I didn't have to say this, but in spite of our efforts to promote disclosure on the part of every victimized child, we cannot be confident that disclosure brings benefits to all victims. There are frequently negative responses from family and friends. Frequently, there's a tremendous amount of exposure that is very uncomfortable and humiliating for the victims. There frequently is secondary harm as a result of the interviews and the court process and the dragging on of the whole problem. And there have been studies now that have looked at this issue of whether there are benefits to children who have disclosed versus those who did not. And I'm afraid it's a wash. It does not look as though disclosure clearly results in improved outcomes. May for some. I don't think that that means we should not promote disclosure, but I do think it really drives home how important it is for us to improve the response that children get from their support system and from the criminal justice system and from the child protection system. And it also means that we have to show some respect and understanding for the children and family and the ambivalence that they have about making disclosures and going forth. Because we haven't been good, we haven't fulfilled our responsibility to make sure that it is beneficial. We do know that having an experience of sexual abuse is associated with a lot of other later life adverse outcomes, from mental health problems to drug and substance abuse to subsequent victimization to problematic relationships with marital partners. This is one of the most concerning features of the problem. But the other side of the coin, I'm afraid, and the one I'm going to emphasize, is that not all victims experience long-term distress. And I think it's very important that we not overstate the fact that all victims are going to be disabled by the experience of their victimization throughout their life. The studies that have been done on long-term mental health outcomes suggest that about a fifth of child sexual abuse victims are experiencing a current mental health disorder at the time that they're interviewed as adults. Which I think suggests a good thing. The percentage of that ever is much higher. It's more in the 50 and 60% range, but it suggests that there's a substantial amount of recovery that occurs. And I think that jives with what we know about human resilience. And the other thing is, although there are these associations, we also increasingly have to acknowledge that some of the association between sexual abuse and later problems may stem from the fact that kids who are having problems prior to being sexually abused, that problem actually put them at risk of being abused. And so what we're in fact counting as an effect of sexual abuse may have been part of the cause. And so there's a confounding there. So this is something that's worth teasing out. But I find that the most important reason to emphasize this is to give people who've been victimized a sense of hope and encouragement. There's a tendency, I think, to think that that bad life outcomes are an inevitability as a result, but that's not the case. All right, my field more than treatment is prevention, and I want to talk about prevention, what we can do, and kind of what's been working, and some of the successes that I think we've had, and some ideas about what else we can be doing. And I'm going to start out by putting up the 4 preconditions model of sexual abuse, which some of you may have had inflicted on you in your graduate education. I hope not too traumatically. My funny story about this is apparently this is widely used in England, and one of the treatment sites had a big poster like this up. It said, Finkelhor, 4 preconditions of sexual abuse. And Princess Margaret was touring the facility, and she came over to the poster. She was fascinated by it. She said, "Oh, what's a Finkelhor?" So that's my 5 seconds of fame. But I think this model is a very useful way of starting to think about prevention. Essentially, I developed this really almost 20 years ago as a way of thinking about all the things that really go into a child being sexually abused. And it posits that for a child to be sexually abused, first of all, there has to be someone around, someone in the child's environment, who has a motivation to sexually abuse. And this is, I won't go into all the details of it, but there's a combination of ingredients here where there's some emotional factor, what I call emotional congruence, some need that's being fulfilled by the sexual activity with the child. There's the capability of being sexually aroused in interaction with the child. And there's blockage, which is an inability of this person to get their sexual and emotional needs met in a more normative way without having to turn to children. But then there are plenty of people around who have some motive or inclination to sexually abuse children, including, I think, many full-blown pedophiles who do not act on those impulses. And why don't they act on those impulses? Well, they're inhibited from doing so at a variety of levels. But I think maybe most powerfully for many of them, they know that to do so would get them into trouble. They know that to do so could land them in jail. They know that to do so is wrong, may be harmful to the child. And so they don't act on those impulses. They inhibit themselves. And I think that's a very powerful thing and explains a lot about why all of us aren't criminals and sexual abusers. But even among those who are not well inhibited, there's another level of defense, which I call external inhibitors. Most children are surrounded by a fortification of adults who are concerned about the child's well-being, institutions that monitor a child's activities, sets of rules and guidelines that create safety for the child. And so children who have those kinds of fortifications are not likely to be sexually abused, even when there is somebody around who might be motivated and uninhibited. And then there's even a fourth level, which I call the resistance by the child. That is to say, many children, even when approached by or solicited by or tempted to be groomed by an offender, don't succumb. They have a sense, this isn't right, I don't want to do this, I'm going to, they get some information, they run away when approached, they say, don't touch me. And we even hear from talking to offenders that they, sometimes make discriminations among kids. I think I could abuse that one, no, that one would be likely to resist. So we know that something that the children carry around with them can put off offenders. So it's only when all of those barriers fail that sexual abuse actually occurs. So how can we use that in our prevention strategies? Well, let me talk first. I'm going to put the motivation to abuse aside for a moment because that's one of the more difficult challenges, and I think maybe a long-term one. But in terms of short-term things, I think there's a great deal that we have done and can do to ramp up the internal inhibitions. For the longest time, nobody ever heard about people who got caught for this kind of crime. So it was very easy, I think, for potential offenders to think, I can do this and get away with this. No one's paying attention. But now, people see individuals getting caught, getting hauled before the juries, being put in jail. And so there's, I think, a considerable change in the whole environment so that offenders know that they can get caught and are much more likely to be afraid of detection and getting caught. Bright line perimeters. Inhibition occurs when people understand better what the rules are. I think there has been in the past and continues to be gray areas about whether, is this okay? This is only touching. This isn't, this isn't really sex. This isn't real abuse. We're clarifying all that, and I think that's another way in which internal inhibitors are strengthened. Debunking abuse rationales. Many offenders carry around with them thinking errors, mistaken ideas. This is just sex education. This will actually improve the child's ability later on. If I'm really nice and caring and tender, this won't be harmful to the child. If we debunk those kinds of rationales, the offenders will be more inhibited. Self-management skills. As I said, a certain amount of sexual abuse involves a failure of offenders to kind of inhibit themselves, even though they might have some inclination to do so in a situation where they would abuse a child. And it partly may be that they don't know how to manage sexual feelings that come up in interactions with kids. I'll talk a little bit more about this later on when I get to youth serving organizations. And then there are external or agents that do compromise, and other agents that compromise the ability of people to inhibit their behavior, like alcohol, like stress and mental illness. These are also things that we can address to improve the ability of offenders or people inclined to offend to inhibit themselves. What can we do at the external inhibition level? Well, one of the things we've been doing is making parents a lot more aware of how abuse occurs, where abuse occurs, what it looks like, that it occurs, and they are able to improve their guardianship. And I think a great deal has occurred in that domain. The same thing applies to people who work in youth serving environments, schools, and so forth, improving their ability to monitor what's going on with kids and keep them safe. Environmental structuring. Some abuse occurs because there are opportunities for adults or potential offenders, including youth, to be alone with potential victims in environments where there may be other inducements, showering, nakedness, sexual materials, and so forth. By structuring environments, we may be able to keep kids safer. Organizational protocols and guidelines about behavior. These are another way of making environments safer for kids. And also incarceration and sex offender management. One of the big external inhibitors is that if guys are in prison, well, they're not out abusing kids. If they're being well monitored by their parole officer, by their offender treatment provider, they are less likely to offend. So these are all external inhibitors that keep kids safe. And then at the level of childhood resistance, there's a lot that we can do in terms of teaching kids what the norms of behavior are, what sexual abuse is, and how to spot it. Giving them refusal and resistance skills so they know how to get away from it, how to deflect it. Giving them emotional security so that they aren't drawn into some of the incentives and lures that offenders can offer them. Positive knowledge about sex so that they aren't kind of turning to these offenders for information and guidance and a sense of excitement to learn about something that they haven't gotten good information about other places. Adult support so they feel like if they say no, if they resist, that an adult will actually have their back and give them support. I do think there are also things that we can do to reduce the original motivation to sexually abuse among potential offenders, although I think we know less about this and have less experience with it. But certainly among the things that probably would be helpful was much more, or we're already doing a considerable amount, but even more treatment of the victims of abuse, because we do know that there is an element of intergenerational transmission such that individuals who themselves abused do seem to have a proclivity to do it again. Reducing family violence exposure. Kids who grow up in families where other people are hitting each other are more likely to become abusers. Affection-based parenting, now I'm getting a little bit out on a limb here, but I strongly believe not just that affection-based parenting is good, that's not what I'm out on a limb about. Yeah, you'll think I'm really out to lunch, if that's what I'm saying. But I think that shame and humiliation are important ingredients to what goes into creating some sexual abusers, and that when children are raised with a lot of punitiveness, and they tend to develop more shame and humiliation and can't deal with impulses that they have in a positive, constructive way. So I think affection-based parenting is a potential prevention in reducing motivation. Images of sexual exploitation, we don't know exactly the role they play, but I think the speculation is that there are at least some people who get the idea from looking at media that shows children being exploited, and to the degree to which we can reduce that, we'll be reducing motives. And changing the definition of masculinity. I've been looking at the Oriental cultures, which seem to have lower rates of sexual abuse and rape, some other kinds of crime. And I think an important component here may be that they have a very different conception of masculinity that doesn't have sexual prowess as a kind of high value. And I think we do, unfortunately, and that this kind of notion of a man as somebody who has lots of sexual experience, who can, is something that does lie behind motives to sexually abuse in enough cases to make this something worth studying. So let me talk a little bit about what we've been doing and where I see some of the strongest initiatives in our current prevention environment. I am a big fan of school-based education programs that are targeted at young people. And we have been doing this now for 20, 25 years. The arguments for it, I think, are very strong, just as in a concept. I call this the logic model. First of all, we do know that it is possible to give and provide kids skills in resistance and avoidance training. That's been well established in areas like drug abuse resistance and bullying prevention. We do know that these programs promote disclosure, and that's one of the targets that they have. These programs don't just have prevention of abuse as their goal. They also have the harm reduction secondary goal, preventing kids from having guilt and feeling stigma and blaming themselves and failing to get help. And so that there's a kind of secondary prevention in all these programs that I think is a very positive thing that they offer. I'm going to skip over stigma reduction because I just mentioned that, but deterrence, I think, is also a possible effect of these programs, because a lot of the recipients of these programs are people who might or who will eventually grow up to be tempted or have some of the ingredients that might lead them to sexually abuse. And having received this kind of education and understanding what the boundaries are, what the norms are, and the harm that this can cause, may be less likely to offend as a result. And also these programs, I think, improve guardianship, because they lots of people in the kids' environment, including parents and teachers and older kids, get exposed to it and get information about sexual abuse. So I think that these are multifaceted programs that are very positive in their potential. There's been a considerable amount of research on these programs. Unfortunately, none of it has really substantiated that they prevent sexual abuse itself. That's a very challenging research task, in part because sexual abuse is a relatively low base rate over the short term, so you have to really have a huge population. But it could be done and should be done. But a lot of the elements of the paradigm do have some research behind them, that sexual abuse that the concepts can be learned, that they are retained. These programs are relatively low cost, and I think I mentioned this point. The other big problem with the program is these programs is that they are a burden on schools and teachers, which are already facing enormous burdens in terms of what they're being expected to do in our society. So I'll come back to some ideas I have about how to deal with that. So I mentioned those things. I'm also a big fan of general public awareness raising. Although in this area it's a little bit hard to show in concrete research terms what effect it's had. By public awareness raising, I mean of training people in the general population. I mean training people in various professions. I mean lots of media coverage about this issue with information about its dynamics and how to prevent it. I think that kind of publicity can be thought of as doing a considerable amount to deter offending, to improve guardianship on the part of parents and other workers, and reducing stigma. I mean, it is a very different thing to grow up in a world today where this topic is being discussed as opposed to a generation ago when you never heard it talked about. And I think that even people who don't actually get treatment get a certain amount of media therapy from seeing this topic discussed and realizing that it happens to other people. And I think that has a very positive, likely has very positive effects in terms of reducing the mental health effects, as well as perhaps helping these people to be guardians of other victims in the future. We've had tremendous developments in the area of mental health treatment of victims and mental health treatment of offenders, both juveniles and victims. I'm sure some people are going to be talking about that. Lucy will be talking about the victim treatment. We have, some of the best research where we actually have randomized clinical trials that show effective treatment options for kids to reduce the amount of mental health symptoms that they have in the wake of being sexually abused, and treating adults who've been sexually abused as kids as well. We have also randomized clinical trials showing that juvenile offender treatment has been effective. The results with regard to adult offender treatment are somewhat more equivocal, but we have a considerable amount of awareness and sophistication in these areas, and you'll get a sense of that in some of the later presentations. I think we have done a tremendous job in terms of ramping up the criminal justice response. And although, once again, this is hard to quantify and assess its impact, it seems to me, from what we know about crime in general, that this makes a lot of sense. The ramped up criminal justice impact activity includes all the aggressive case finding and disclosure promotion that law enforcement has done, the training that law enforcement has received in investigating and conducting interviews with victims and families and offenders, the development of multidisciplinary teams and children's advocacy centers to make the law enforcement response much more child-friendly and much more successful in ferreting out disclosures of sexual abuse that are actually useful in the criminal justice system. As a prevention strategy, this has a strong logic to it. It takes offenders out of circulation. It reduces the chance for continued or renewed offending. It deters offenders because they see a likelihood of them getting caught and therefore inhibit themselves. And it can reduce the secondary trauma to victims by engaging them in a process that is helpful rather than hurtful after the abuse is disclosed. So now for kind of the end game here, and to talk a little bit about what has been changing. I am encouraged by all of what we're doing, not just because it has a logic to it that seems to me to really have changed a great deal, but because we have increasing amounts of data now that suggest that in fact the problem has been declining. And I know this is controversial to some people, so I just wanted to tell you, I actually think that the evidence has just been growing and is increasingly incontrovertible on this issue. And unfortunately, it's not been all that well publicized. But let me take you through some of it so that you can see that it's not just Finkelhor blowing smoke. So the one thing that I think is well measured, that is at least consistently measured from year to year, is the data coming from the child protection system that has, for now, over 20 years, been collecting these reports of substantiated abuse in the states and then presenting them as aggregate statistics. Those substantiated sexual abuse cases have declined a remarkable 62% from the period between 1990 to 2010, down by almost 2/3. And just so that you know that it's not just all child maltreatment cases that are declining. In fact, no, neglect cases have actually been relatively stable. So it's not just a function of the child protection system substantiating less stuff. The sexual abuse has actually declined more than other forms of maltreatment, and I think that's probably, and that may be in part because of all the stuff that we're doing. But then, it's not just data from the child protection. The data that we can collate from law enforcement shows a very similar and parallel kind of trend. And what I've got here is the line on the forcible rape that it gets reported to law enforcement agencies. This is something that is tracked by the FBI every year from local law enforcement agencies. Now, forcible rape isn't just about kids, but from other studies we know that a little more than half of all forcible rape actually involves victims under the age of 18. The forcible rape that actually shows up on police blotters. So here's another independent source of data that shows also a fairly large decline, although not as great as the decline in sexual abuse. Then, I told you about this study that every year, every 10 or 12 years, counts what youth-serving professionals know that's coming to their attention. They did a study back in 2005 that was a follow-up on data that they had gathered in 1993 using exact same definitions, exact same procedures. And they confirmed, in fact, that sexual abuse had declined substantially over this period of time, which was a good reality check that suggested that it wasn't just changed standards or changed reporting procedures or something about the way the numbers were being collected by CPS or by the police that was really at work. But these are three sources that show what's been happening with cases that are coming to the attention of professionals. Of course, it could be, that those had gone down, but that the victimization, especially the huge amount of victimization that never gets to attention of professionals, was not changing at all. But we now have 4 large-scale survey studies that also show comparable kinds of declines in the experience of sexual abuse. This one is from the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is conducted by the U.S. Department of Justice every year. It involves interviews with close to 100,000 citizens about their crime victimization experiences over the previous 6 months. It's probably the most sophisticated and largest regular social science undertaking in the country. It does not ask about sexual abuse and child molesting, but it does ask about sexual assault. It doesn't gather information on all children, but it gathers information on children ages 12 to 17. And there's been a 69% decline in youth reporting having been victims of sexual assault in that survey. This is a large survey that is conducted every 3 years by the state of Minnesota of all 6th, 9th, and 12th graders. They ask them about a variety of risk behaviors and vulnerability situations, including whether they were sexually abused at any time in their life. So this isn't, the other measures that I've shown you up until now have been past year measures. This is a lifetime measure. It's not quite as sensitive to change as the past year measures, but even here you see among the kids who say that they've ever been sexually abused by a non-family adult or by a family member, there's been pretty substantial decline over this same period. Here's another large-scale national survey that's conducted, the National Survey of Family Growth, conducted by the federal government. It's a question that tries to track fertility and sexual behavior, particularly among young women. They ask a question about whether their first sexual intercourse had occurred prior to the age of 5 with somebody who was prior to the age of 15 with somebody who was at least 5 or more years older. A pretty substantial decline in the percentage of these young women who say that they had such an experience, once again, over the same period of time. There are some other studies that bolster this. There are additional facts about things that have been changing, like declines in teen pregnancy and running away, that also suggest that there's some reality to this change. I think it is about as confirmed as we get in thinking about crime statistics these days, to have something showing up in such multiple sources. But you may have some questions about it. Oh, this is one other thing I forgot. Also a slide that is very encouraging. These are from studies that show that there has been a decline in recidivism among convicted sex offenders. That is, if you look at the red line, that shows the recidivism levels among individuals who had been released prior to 1990 into the community, the level that they would reoffend in 5 years. The blue line shows what has happened to the cohort of those released about after 1990. The static 99 score is a measure of the riskiness of these individuals. The good news is that offender recidivism has declined, and it's particularly declined among the most serious offenders. So that's also good news that points in the same direction. What lessons can we take from this? Well, one is that big improvements are possible and can come quickly. And I think that that's very positive. I think another thing that we should take to heart is, that we're making some progress. We should be encouraged by what's happening. We should be encouraged to think we can do better based on the fact that we've been having some success up till now. I do think that there have been people in this field, unfortunately, who have thought, oh, shut Finkelhor up. They're going to take away our money. They're going to declare, the mission accomplished and say, well, now we can go on and deal with something else. I think that's not true. I think policymakers and politicians like to see the results coming from their investments, and other people in other areas, in the general crime area and in the teen pregnancy prevention area, have publicized their successes and used them as arguments for doing better, and I think we could do the same. So I don't think there's anything to be afraid of in this data, and I think it can actually, in reality, be an argument not just for doing more, but a way of encouraging the troops and saying, we seem to be on the right track. I do think that these findings also point to the importance of epidemiology. We do need to be counting stuff. If we, unfortunately, we can't break this down at the level we would like to. Are we doing as well with teachers? Are we doing as well with, as we are with overall? If we had that data, it might greatly improve our prevention efforts, but we don't have that. And then we need to be careful what we abandon. We may be unhappy or dissatisfied with some of what our kind of smorgasbord of approaches has been, but if they're having results, well, we should be careful not to abandon something that might have turned out to have been successful. All right, I'm not far from done. I realize a lot of people have questions, and it is hard to listen to one person, or especially me, for a long period of time. But let me just throw out some new ideas, some things that I think, for those of you who've been in this field for a while, might be things that we could be thinking about more, in the prevention area particularly. I think we need to expand the attention that we've been giving to some facets of the problem that have received less attention in the past. I think the interest in the sexual abuse of boys has been long overdue, and has been one of the silver linings of all the attention that we've gotten from the priest abuse scandal, from the Boy Scout publicity, from the Penn State case. We see men coming forward, being courageous, talking about what happened to them. I think this has really empowered a lot of other men and boys, but it's still pretty clear that the abuse of boys is underreported and we can do a better job of identifying the dynamics and finding ways of talking to them, encouraging abuse, and responding to them in a helpful way. But there are a lot of other dimensions of the problem that I don't think have gotten sufficient attention: date rape, statutory sex crime. Let me talk a little bit about the statutory sex crime. One of the things that prevention science tells us is that it's easier to prevent problems where the norms and boundaries are unclear. If people are vague about, what the driving rules are in a certain area, they're likely to speed. But if you put up a sign that says in big letters that flashes, 35 miles per hour, they will slow down. We've done a pretty good job of putting some of these bright perimeters up in the area of sexual abuse of children, but I think in the area of statutory sexual relationships between adults and teenagers, we have not. I think there are a lot of people out there, young people and adults, who don't know what the age of consent is, who don't know why we have these laws, who see sexy young people in the media and on the street in the schoolyard and think, why not invite them to the party? Why don't I invite myself to the party? And we could, I think, do a great deal by making these bright lines brighter. I think a lot of people are a little bit hard-pressed to formulate the argument about why we do have these statutory sex crime laws. One of them is, and I think this is something we need to continue to remind people about, is that we want adults to act as mentors and guardians and guides for children, and that when sexual relationships and sexual impulses come into the play, it makes it more difficult for them to be objective and think about the needs of the child. So we draw these lines. We understand that it is developmentally inappropriate that children, even who seem to be acting sexy or even engaging in sexual behavior with their peers, are not really at a developmental stage where they can cope with a sexual relationship with an adult. We also know that adults have very large incentives, and a lot of power differential exists in these relationships. They drive cars, they have lots of money, they're cool in all kinds of ways, and that given these power differentials, we really do not believe that children have the true ability to consent to these relationships. So I think we need to be making these arguments. There's a really neat group up in Seattle, the King County Sexual Assault Center, which is developing some brochures for kids and adults about age of consent. I think this is a great idea, something that kids are interested in, and something we should be talking much more about. But I think we have to be honest about the dynamics of statutory or compliant victim cases, that it does involve children who sometimes are very even aggressive in seeking out sexual relationships with adults. But this is something that adults have a responsibility not to get involved with. Another thing that we can do in this area and in areas in general is mobilize more of the bystanders. One of the things we found out in our research on sexual abuse, and particularly with teens, is that oftentimes other young people know that one of their friends is involved in one of these unhealthy relationships, but they are at a loss as to how to talk to their friend, what to do. They don't want to be disloyal. They don't want to alienate their friend. They may not be sure of how bad it is or what the problem is. So there's a lot of potential to mobilize the bystanders and help prevent and short-circuit some of these relationships. The research on bystander mobilization has been very promising in the area of bullying, very promising in the area of college date rape prevention. And I think there's lots of reason to think that it could be extremely helpful in the area of child sexual abuse prevention as well. A lot of our prevention programs have been targeted at the general population of children, all school children, all children who, all Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts. But one thing that comes up again and again in the literature is how there are groups of kids who are particularly vulnerable, who are neglected, needy, suffering, depression, rejection, isolation. And we need to think a lot more about how we can direct prevention at these high-risk groups, how we can draw them in, the special skills that they may need as part of other interventions that they may be receiving. And those programs may look very different in the end from the kind of all-purpose primary prevention kinds of things that we do. So there's a great deal, I think, of work to be done on that. One particular group that I think deserves particular attention, has been very badly ignored, is young people, especially boys, who are dealing with sexual orientation issues. This is a very vulnerable group that are often rejected by their friends, or who don't feel close to their family, who don't know how to get information about something that they're really struggling with and having strong feelings about. They're very vulnerable to go out there online or out there in the community and meet up with somebody who offers to help them, but really doesn't have their interest at heart. And this is a group I think we could do a lot better on behalf of providing them with mentors and adults who can give them information and who are not going to exploit them, to help them feel better about themselves, to not feel as stigmatized and as isolated. I think in reducing some of that isolation will help to remove some of the vulnerability for this group. But this is a group we probably need to be working with through gay rights organizations, adults, and in a variety of other places, particularly, for example, some of the sites online where people go to meet other gay individuals. Youth-serving organizations. This is beginning to take off. There's still a lot to do. Some of our major youth-serving organizations collaborated with the CDC to develop this booklet to help educate other organizations. But there are, thousands of youth-serving organizations in this country and millions of kids involved in them. And while the more centralized, better heeled, and more forward-thinking of these organizations have kind of climbed aboard and are working, and there's still probably the majority of these organizations that really have not done very much in this area. There really is a lot to do. I like to think about, these kinds of 6 areas where these organizations really need to develop a program. Screening, but I think of screening in these organizations as not primarily, looking for background records or even calling up prior employers and organizations, although that is important to do. I think probably the most powerful screening is the covert screening, the screening that provides somebody with the information early on. We're an organization that really takes this kind of behavior very seriously. We really monitor for it, and essentially says, this is something that you think you might get involved in, this probably isn't the place for you. Standards and norms, developing guidelines about what's acceptable and unacceptable behavior, like the 2 deep rule that the Scouts use, and rules about kinds of extracurricular contact that people can have, or the kinds of places where the use of sexual banter or sexual kind of reference is allowed. Training all the staff to detect the kinds of behaviors that may result in violations of standards and sexual abuse. The mentoring management skills. I just want to touch on this kind of briefly, because it gets back to the issue that I talked about when I was talking about the situational molester. I think there's been a lack of acknowledgement that, honesty about the fact that when you work with young people, sexual feelings get provoked. Teenagers, and even prepubescent teens, are trying out sexuality and coquettishness, and adults and sexual feelings can get provoked in lots of ordinary and well-meaning people. This kind of thing is widely acknowledged in the psychotherapy field, for example, where therapists get a lot of training that the intimacy of the counseling room does create oftentimes not just sexual feelings, but other feelings that can interfere with the relationship. But this is not something that we talk about to teachers. This is not something that we talk about to coaches. It's a very tricky subject to raise because nobody wants to admit that that happens. But I then think that there are a lot of people who are unprepared to deal with those feelings when they come up. So they don't process them well. We need to develop ways, I think, of providing educational modules so people understand that this is not unusual and that there are good ways of dealing with it that are not harmful to the organization, to the child. Educating youth and parents, I think I've talked a lot about that, and promoting disclosure. These are all, I think, tasks that these organizations should take on. Now, a big problem that we face is that in the current prevention environment, sexual abuse prevention education is competing with a whole raft of other prevention initiatives. People want to prevent date rape. They want to prevent suicide. They want to prevent drug abuse. They want to prevent bullying. School principals and superintendents and youth-serving organizations are bombarded with initiatives to do prevention work. And unfortunately, they can't take all of them on at once. And so I think that the real challenge for this field is finding ways to integrate sexual abuse prevention education in the context of all the other abuse, all the other prevention goals that we have for young people. And we really haven't thought all that much about that yet. We've developed a lot of our prevention stuff in isolation. So we have to figure out whether there are common, generalized prevention skills that can be taught in the context that would also prevent not just sexual abuse, but bullying, dating violence, health, and so forth. And then we have to evaluate to see whether there's enough sexual abuse content in these programs. This is a challenge, but I really think it is where the field is headed, and that we will fail in our prevention efforts if we keep the sexual abuse prevention stuff as a kind of standalone prevention program. I do think if you analyze, the problems, that there are a lot of common and generic skills, that the refusal skills, that the risk analysis stuff, that the disclosure stuff, that the emotion management issues are common to a lot of these prevention efforts and could be taught in some kind of comprehensive and integrated way. I did talk a little bit about bystander mobilization. I don't want to belabor that. I am about done, so good. I know the hook when it's coming. Just a couple of other things. I do think there are other steps we can take to make the law enforcement environment child-friendlier even than it is. One thing that's a pet concern of mine is that I still think it takes way too long to prosecute and resolve cases that involve juvenile victims, and that this is something we can do to make it easier. But there's still a lot of places where there's not enough support. I do think there might be potential for new offender inhibition strategies. I saw some really powerful public media efforts that have been used in Germany to inhibit sexual abuse behavior among men. Developmental prevention, I think I'll pass over that. In any case, here's some resources. Well, I'm just going to go. This is my book, which is available. I just wanted to end with this. I saw this picture when I was in Madrid a couple weeks ago. Interestingly, it's by the famous artist, grandson of Sigmund Freud, Lucian Freud. It was painted in 1960s, so I don't think it was actually probably about sexual abuse. But I felt like it really conveyed, to some extent, the kind of feeling that I have about what sexual abuse does to its victims, the kind of the sense of aloneness, the feeling that even ordinary kinds of beautiful and things like a plant here have a certain threatening quality to it, a kind of dissociation from the world, and that the coat is kind of the lingering image or presence of the abuse that sort of is there and kind of looms large in the child's reality. Anyways, with that, I'm happy to take some questions. And I don't know, how's this format supposed to work? Is it? They're going to ask me. Okay, so it isn't, we're not giving you a chance to talk. This is more chance for me to talk, but maybe to answer some specific questions that you have.
All right, so we're going to have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions.
Sure.
Okay. The first question comes via Twitter. Is there any reason to believe that male children are less likely to disclose? And going along with that, what role might this play in prevalence statistics?
Oh, yes, they are less likely to disclose. And in fact, if you compare the rates with which they are present in disclosed cases and versus the cases that are present in the victim surveys, there are many fewer boys in the disclosed cases than in the victim surveys. So yes, it does affect.
Kind of going along with some of the statistics, are some of the statistics in some countries lower because they look at it using a different definition? So for example, married young teenagers, women and girls as property. What role also might cultural stigma play in prevalence statistics in these countries?
Cultural stigma probably does play a role. And it's something we need to look at. And I don't have time to go into it, but I'm just working on a paper on that right now because after looking at the Chinese data, for example, I'm pretty sure that cultural stigma isn't the whole story there. Mostly these surveys in countries around the world use standardized, validated inventories of child sexual abuse, but that don't use that term, simply ask about behaviors and so things like the cultural definition of marriage and so forth aren't I don't think factors in the differences internationally very much.
Next question is, can you please talk more about youth-on-youth abuse and some questions that go along with that? As a parent, what's a sign that we should watch for between peers, and when does it become more than curiosity?
Let me answer the first one. I mean, curiosity can lead to sexual abuse. So in that sense, I don't think one should distinguish between curiosity and sexual abuse. Now, there is the whole question that can be challenging in terms of identifying sexual abuse among like preschool kids who are exploring each other's genitals. And I mean, the usual thing that's said there is that if a child is feeling bad about it, if it seems to be signs that adult behavior is being enacted, if there's force or coercion involved, this is something that parents ought to and adults ought to intervene with. I admit that's not always easy to assess. In the case of other youth, I think some of the same signs that we use to identify sexual abuse in kind of all environments, a child, relationship that looks like it's occurring with a lot of secrets, a child who's feeling uncomfortable, or kind of inappropriate closeness between an older and younger youth, certain kinds of physical signs and symptoms of genital trauma and irritation. Those are all things that need to be looked for. Sort of feel like I'm ignoring you over there, but the questions are all coming from over there. What about you guys over there?
Can you speak to the meaningfulness of making a distinction between predatory and, quote, non-predatory offenders? And is the impact on children any different?
Well, I think I made clear that I distinguish between predatory and non-predatory in the sense of whether the offender sort of came into relationship with the child with the goal of sexually abusing. I don't think we know the answer to that, but just from what I know about the impact of sexual abuse, I don't think the fact that the adult was predatory necessarily means that is going to be more or less impactful. I mean, I think the conclusion about the impact of sexual abuse is that there are enormous number of diverse influences, and so one cannot make presumptions on the basis of any one feature of the case, who it was and what the sexual act was and, what the age of the child was. There's a diverse number, and so the actual impact on the child has to be assessed independently of those features.
The next question is just asking about the vulnerability of children with intellectual, physical, and social disabilities. If you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, they're definitely at risk. They're both at risk to be victims, and they're at risk to be offenders. So that is a population that does need some particular attention. Good question.
With the misconception that juvenile offending is a gateway to more deviant sexual behavior, what are your thoughts about, or what are the implications for the utility of the sex offender registries? And what are your thoughts on some of the changes that might be occurring in December related to the Adam Walsh Act?
Ooh, this is controversial, and might merit a longer discussion. And so I will preface this by saying there are a lot of opinions about this, but I am really not a fan of sex offender registries for juveniles. I'm not a fan of sex offender registries that much in general. I think they give a false sense of security. I think, to be used by law enforcement, but the whole idea of the research that's been done on sex offender registries has not shown them to be useful in terms of reducing recidivism. And I think particularly for teenagers, the boomerang effect is to avoid ending up on a registry, there's maybe a tendency to not bring these kinds of cases to official attention, to handle them in ways that don't make clear that a sexual violation occurred. I think these are all bad trends. Our philosophy of juvenile justice for a whole century has been that when kids commit crime, there's a strong potential for us to rehabilitate them. All the research that we've done on juvenile sex offenders suggests that the rehabilitation potential is as great or greater than it is with other kinds of juvenile offending. I really think we should use that same philosophy in dealing with juvenile sex offenders.
The next one also comes from Twitter. If money and resources for child sexual abuse and resource centers declines, could we see an increase in rape and child sexual abuse?
Well, it has declined, I think. So we're doing that experiment right now. The good news is that in the face of the big recession and the cutback in all kinds of funding, crime rates continue to decline into 2011. So that's, there's a cautious optimism there. There was recently a report from the Bureau of Justice Statistics showing that the National Crime Victimization Survey showed an uptick in crime victimization in the National Crime Victimization Survey, but it was all in the simple and aggravated assault. The sex crime stuff actually declined an additional 9% into 2011 in the National Crime Victimization Survey. So I don't know. My own personal view, but I'm a registered Pollyanna, is that we have really changed a lot of the environment, and that those things don't go back to where they were when funding declines. Some of the things change, but a lot of it doesn't.
You spoke about the protective role of men as early caregivers. Can you talk a little bit more about that and the seeming paradox of this in role of the light that some stepfathers, fathers, brothers, grandfathers are perpetrators of intrafamilial abuse?
Yeah. Well, there's some interesting research from the anthropological literature that suggests, for example, that there are some kind of maybe innate incest or sexual contact avoidance mechanisms. You know, brothers and sisters don't tend to be sexually interested in one another, and the fact that stepfathers seem to be higher risk, and they're not people who were around when the children were young, is supportive of that. And then we did a study on Navy men who spend a lot of time in deployment, and we found, in fact, that the rates of involvement in early child care were lower among the Navy men who had committed sexual abuse of their children than among other Navy men. And I think there's something to think. There's something there possibly that when parents are intimately involved in the care of their children from an early age, including their bodily functions and giving them nurturance and all that, that it creates a kind of antagonist somehow to seeing that child as a sexual object, or maybe sort of catalyzes or mobilizes some protective feelings that make it more difficult to act on those behaviors. So I think it's probably something that deserves more study.
I think you partially addressed this, but just wanted to ask again, what proportion of offenders were themselves victims of sexual abuse? And also, what proportion of victims actually go on to offend?
Well, the answer to the first question is about 50%, so about half of offenders report a history. But the other part of the question we really don't know. But it is clear that most boys who were sexually abused do not go on to reoffend. So although the risk is higher, we'd be, we need to understand that it is still a low rate, and you can't simply use history of having been abused as a risk marker any more than you could use, say, being single as a risk marker.
Have you ever done any research on the high rate of perpetrators on YouTube?
High rate of perpetrators what?
On YouTube?
On YouTube?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
That was easy.
Okay. The next question has to do with alcoholism and drug abuse. Can you talk a little bit about the role these play as risk factors?
Alcohol and drug abuse are risk factors for pretty much all problematic and deviant behavior, and for a variety of reasons. They undermine inhibitions. They put you into contact with other antisocial elements. And they also are frequently reflective of people who are having coping difficulties, and so therefore, may be prone to other kinds of shortcut coping strategies like getting sexual gratification where they're not supposed to. So it's definitely a strong risk marker, and I firmly believe, although I don't know that there's a lot of research on this, that treating those features is helpful in reducing recidivism.
Again, you spoke about this, but wanted to ask again more specifically, what are some useful strategies that we can teach our children to protect themselves and to feel empowered in order to prevent childhood sexual abuse?
Well, the key elements of the sex abuse prevention education paradigm are, first of all, to give children knowledge about what the norms are here, what's inappropriate, that an adult or an older person touching their sexual or private parts is wrong, that giving them information about the dynamics so that they can see these kinds of things coming, somebody who wants to talk with them about sex, or someone who wants to show them sexual materials, or someone who seems overly interested in their private life, or who's touching them in ways that aren't typical the way in which adults interact with kids. These kinds of things are useful to tell kids. We need to give them the vocabulary for talking about these things, including vocabulary about their sexual parts and the kinds of sexual activities that might be involved. We need to talk to them about The problem of disclosure, the fact that someone might tell them not to disclose, or it may seem embarrassing to them to disclose, but why it's important for them to do so, and how to do so, and how not to be deterred if they don't get help from their first disclosure. It's not a large number of concepts, but I think that's this is the kind of skill set that we want kids to have. I didn't mention refusal skills. I don't think that, how to say no, how to get away, how to defer the attentions that the older person may be trying to oppose.
Can you talk a little bit about how power and power dynamics play a role or not in child sexual abuse?
Well, they play a role in a lot of sexual abuse, especially the abuse that occurs at the hands of older children and adults and more popular children. There was a meme out there for a while that rape and sexual abuse was all about power and control and not about sex, and I think that's now seen as not really true. There may be power and control elements, but for a considerable number of offenders, there is a clear sexual motive involved. And when that sexual motive is lacking, other kinds of abuse may occur, but the sexual abuse isn't necessarily what happens. So power is an element, but is not the exclusive or the main element.
How do you assess for institutional child sexual abuse in organizations and promote effective disclosure?
I think I covered that to some extent about, really training staff in what to look for and how to deal with responses from kids, and organizations need to provide families and children with information. And I strongly encourage parents to ask organizations that their kids involved in, what are you doing on this issue? And for organizations to take some steps. What we really need, unfortunately, because so many of these organizations are small, mom and pop variety, without a lot of funding, without a lot of access to consultants, is we need a kind of national clearinghouse of sexual abuse prevention resources where they're kind of modular thing, off-the-shelf programs and protocols and training that the organizations can take and adapt for their usage without having to kind of develop it on their own. But unfortunately, we don't have that yet. And maybe that's something Penn State would like to do.
In light of the complexities that you spoke about in understanding the prevalence of child sexual abuse, is it safe for us to continue to use the 1 in 4 and 1 in 6 statistics?
I think not. But what I'm embarrassed about is that, since I'm Mr. Prevalence rate, I don't have a good other number to give people yet, because I don't think we've had really enough surveys of the general population among the current cohort of kids to really develop a clear new estimate. I think that the 1 in 4 and 1 in 6 is probably now an overestimate, but it's not tremendously off. You could see that the 17% among girls and the 4% among boys in the survey, the 2011 survey I gave you, is somewhat lower than that. That's what I'm using right now, and maybe you can use that. But what I'm hoping to do is do more of a meta-analysis in the near future to help us think about what the better number is to cite.
Well, thank you so much.
All right, good.
We're going
Well,
to finish up the
you've been
Q&A.
so good. Thank you.
Now, I want to let people know that we'll break until 11:15. Please be back in your seats, and please join me in thanking Dr.
very
Finkelhor
welcome.
for giving us a terrific start to the conference.